Hello and welcome to the Being Human podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Bottaro, and today we are going to dive really deep into the questions and issues and confusion around gender, what it is, gender dysphoria, what that is, and why and how we can make sense of this. And I have a very particular angle that I'm taking here, and it's one of proposal. I'm proposing to our audience, to the church, to the world, institutions, everyone from parents to teachers and missionaries and ministers alike, a way to look at this that maybe is a little different. And I don't mean different in that it's not going to be right in line and in step with Catholic teaching. I mean different, it's in that we're going to take the lead on this conversation. And not the lead in which we just simply repeat over and over again the old teachings of the church that are locked in, objective, and true, and good and beautiful. That method seems to be lacking, seems to be wanting. I think we need something new in terms of our approach, our method. And if we tap into the depths of faith and reason and science coming together, I think we can provide hope to the culture, and we can actually point a way forward that leads people. It leads culture. It leads the world. It leads and gives answer to the kinds of questions that are coming up right now. And my model in my mind that I want to share with you, that you can maybe experience that some of the same hope that comes like light in the darkness, is think about what happened with the sexual revolution of the 20th century. Even though that was it was a very devastating time, and there was a lot of bad things that came out of it, and there's a lot of badness that surrounds it, and even still we're reaping the rotten fruit of it. Also clarified which questions needed to get answered in a more thorough way from the church. And it's because of the sexual revolution, to really oversimplify things here, that we ended up with an answer like the theology of the body. And it was the work of St. John Paul II that listened to the culture. He was listening to the culture. He was listening to people suffering and struggling and had questions. And they were the ones coming to the churches, coming to the retreats, coming to the confessional, and asking really good, important, and deep questions. And we're not being satisfied and catered to from the age-old teachings of the church. And so he needed to be able to present the teachings of the church, the traditional age-old teachings of the church, in a way that met the needs of people in contemporary times. And it's because the questions from contemporary times were being formulated in a new way that the answers needed to be formulated in a new way. And it wasn't just a reformulation, but it was actually a deepening. And that's where I want to show the hope and the light and the brightness on the other side. This is the silver lining in the cloud. This is what we can have a real belief and know that Jesus has conquered, period. He has overcome death across the board, and he can redeem everything and anything, including this current cultural confusion. It's going to be redeemed. The battle's already over. So how, in this way, in this particular context, is this particular battle going to be redeemed? I think we can point a way forward. So in other words, we want to look at the questions coming up from the culture now and understand that the church can offer hope in the same way that the church offered something really beautiful and profound in the theology of the body and the teachings of John Paul II that answered the questions that were being asked during the sexual revolution. So that's what we're going to dig into here. We're going to go a little bit deeper. And again, I'm sending this out as a proposal, as an open-ended question to you, my dear listeners and friends. And I want to hear from you if you've seen this kind of approach, if you've tried this kind of approach, if you want to hear more about this kind of approach. I think this is really important for where we are at. All right, so in the last episode, we were just talking kind of generally speaking about gender and sexual development, psychosexual development, and understanding ourselves and our identity. And in this series and in our teaching, we sometimes interchange the use of the word gender and sex. And in a way, I want to bring back reclaiming the word gender. Some people don't like using the word gender because it's something that was developed out of psychology and the very, very dark, very distorted, sort of secret hidden history of psychology, which this is not an episode to unveil the darkness of the field of secular psychology, but there is a psychologist who's formed a tremendous amount of our understanding in the secular field of psychology, John Money. You may have, if you've seen the documentary, What is a Woman? Matt Walsh does a great job exposing the evil and the errors of that fundamental building block of secular psychology. And so out of that work was what gave birth to the term gender and gender expression as a way to separate out the biology from the person. And of course, as Catholics, we want to reintegrate the biology with the person. But I like the word gender. I think it's a great word, and it refers back to generate, and it refers to the genitalia. It refers to this whole process of procreation. And I think that if we use the language appropriately and actually looking at the etymology of words, then it's a great way to talk about how we're expressing ourselves, our fully integrated body and spirit as a man or a woman. And so we can come to understand that when we are biologically male, we are called to, made to, and ordered to express ourselves through our gender as male. And that way we can understand when somebody is identifying in their gender internally as the opposite sex, or coming up with some other sort of paradigm of classification other than their male or femaleness in their biology, we can see that as a gender dysphoria. When somebody doesn't feel related to, connected to, identified as their biological sex. And so I'm okay with using the word gender as long as we understand that that's deeply tied into our biology. That's the philosophical fundamental premise of the real conversation here. And we're going to get into in future episodes here in this series how to have the conversation about gender and gender dysphoria or gender confusion. And I think just a really good starting point is to recognize that these conversations that are happening on social media and in the whole world of agenda-driven politics and everything else, the conversation is not happening in the right place. It's like the abortion conversation. How many people actually want to kill babies who are pro-choice? I'm not sure that that's the majority position for somebody who's pro-choice. What's the real conversation that should be happening? What is a person? Talking about, whether or not a pre-born child in the womb is philosophically defined as a person. Now, that's an interesting conversation. That's a philosophical conversation. And that doesn't carry the emotional baggage of whether or not you're a baby murderer. Like that's like why are we having that conversation? Just like, so in gender and all of these questions about, trans politics and all these kinds of things, it's like the debate, the conversation ends up being like, do you hate people? Do you want to take away people's rights and freedoms and you want people to be miserable? It's like, wait a minute, how did we end up there in this conversation? Like, we're talking about things that are deeply philosophical, and there's no connection between our premise for our belief in our argument and then these conclusions that end up being the debate points. So that's why I think we need to really sort of dig in a little bit more to understanding what is the actual conversation that needs to be happening here. So if we sort of break this down into what is the intrinsic connection between our body and our spirit and our personhood, that's really the fundamental debate that's happening here. Just like the philosophical debate about when a person exists and whether, a person exists at conception or not. It's like, all right, now that person exists, what's the next debate is like, what is a person? Is a person made up of body and spirit, of material and immaterial things? So that's, I think, going to be a more interesting conversation. I think that's a more interesting debate. And maybe that's less emotionally charged than sort of the rights of these adults or how kids are supposed to, have freedom to express who they really are, quote unquote. Kids should have freedom to express who they really are, quote unquote. Like, that's our position as Catholics. That's actually the fundamental building block of all human dignity. This is the really preposterous thing, is that the sort of the hijacking of a Catholic position is to turn a fundamental building block and point of dignity on us and turn it around on its head and make it into an argument against our position. It's like, if you read the philosophy of St. John Paul II, it's the most fundamental point that we have self-determination, that our freedom is our dignity. Dignity is defined by having self-determination and freedom. Without freedom, without self-determination, we couldn't understand having dignity. So this is where this conversation has gotten warped. But I want to go a little bit into the psychology now. So that's the philosophy, that's the argument, that's where it's happening, and that's where it's happening. And this is where we could probably move it to happen in a better way philosophically. But of course, I'm here to talk about the psychology. So what are we looking at here with the way that all of that gender development, that biopsychosocial, spiritual, personal development that we touched on last week in the last episode, natural, normal, healthy development, how does that create a situation in which we have a gender dysphoria, or this sort of new experience that even the literature is trying to catch up on and make sense of this rapid onset gender dysphoria, or rapid onset. It's like the culture just got swept away with a tidal wave of confusion, chaos. Everybody's doubting themselves now. All these kids in school now are questioning their identity, their sexual identity. Am I a man, or am I a boy? Am I a girl? And all of that. So how did this happen so quickly? That's what we want to try to make sense of, because that's really actually happening. Well, remember then, and you should review the last episode if you haven't listened to it yet, but we have a fundamental need to actually develop a masculine and feminine part of ourselves. This is not against Catholic teaching of the human person. And in fact, my proposal is that if you stick with me through this episode and the next episode, I think we're going to find out that at the depths of Catholic teaching, in the depths of Catholic mysticism and Catholic theology and Catholic philosophy, there is an answer that has not been fully fleshed out and articulated yet, in the same way that the theology of the body was already present in Catholic teaching before John Paul II articulated it. In other words, there's not a whole lot in the theology of the body that's radically fundamentally new. And if you look at the mystics of the church, the spiritual theology, if you look at the deep philosophical tradition, so if you go back to like the Desert Fathers and you go to, the great saints, mystics, and doctors of the church, you find all the same principles that are in the theology of the body. But it wasn't drawn out. It wasn't fleshed out. It wasn't manifest out in writing that was accessible to the normal person in the pew, the normal lay person in the church. So that's why the culture, which the normal laity and normal person in the pew contributes to, was so deceived by the lies of the sexual revolution. And that's why we need to equip and empower the laity with the truth of the Catholic teachings of the church to become the new culture. This is why the theology of the body is a ticking time bomb, as George Weigel wrote about in his biography of JP2. And the ticking time bomb, I talk about this in another episode, and we'll link to this too. It's not a ticking time bomb like it's going to explode all at once. It's more of a genetic mutation of culture, where little by little we equip the laity with the teachings of the theology of the body, and then they teach their kids, and their kids become the new church. And maybe that takes 3 or 2 generations. And it will, over time, genetically mutate the church. And that's what's happening right now. So these teachings are already there in the church. This is not radically new. But because the culture is asking new questions, we need to have new formulations of the answer. And it is pulling from the tradition of the church to give these answers. This is what is going to happen with gender confusion. This is my hope. This is my belief. I firmly believe that this is going to happen. And I'm happy and excited and blessed and grateful to be a part of forging the path forward through this mess. And that's why when I say, like, I'm proposing this out there to others, I really mean that. Like, it's not like a feigned false humility. Like, I have no idea how many other people out there are already thinking this way, already know these things should be true. And I just want to stick my neck out there here, just so that other people might be like, oh yeah, that's what we're doing too. Let's do this together. Like, let's collaborate. Let's talk. Or just push back on what I'm saying if there's like something I'm missing, because I'm only one person and we're only one group. And we have a lot of this conversation internally at the Catholic Psych Institute. And there's a lot that this is being formulated through our internal collaboration. But we want to collaborate with others externally as well and bring this out to the world and be a part of this worldwide hope that we can offer and the answer that Jesus provides. So in the development of the human person, to kind of circle back, I want to just accentuate the fact that every male person has a male biology and has a natural proclivity towards, a natural disposition towards male characteristics. And every male person, and this is the part that people might not really realize, every male person has a capacity, and not only a capacity, but a responsibility to develop feminine characteristics. And now I'm not saying feminine bodies. So this is where we can nuance our understanding of hylomorphism. Okay, fancy word alert. Hylomorphism is a philosophical principle that has to do with the combination of spirit and body, and philosophically form and matter. And this goes back to Aristotle, but that a thing has a sort of a combination and a unity between its form and its matter. So a person is a thing to study as an object. It has a form, which is the spiritual dimension of the person, and it has matter, which is the physical dimension of the person. So that's why the body and spirit are one, because everything has both a form and matter. And a person can't be separated out and say, well, the form of this person is male, but the matter of this person is female. It's completely, totally, philosophically, and realistically illogical and nonsensical. It's like, all right, if I'm holding a coffee cup in my hand, I can abstract in my mind, in my intellect, the form of what a coffee cup is. It's like, what's coffee cupness? Like, what is the essence? What is the sort of like sense of what a coffee cup is? And if I had 3 coffee cups, a blue, a white, and a black coffee cup, I would say, like, and they're different sizes, different shapes. They have different printing on them. We could say right now I have a coffee cup in my hand. It's from the Hildebrand Project, actually. Coincidentally, maybe providentially, the Hildebrand Project doing awesome work promoting a lot of these truths we're talking about here. And so maybe I have another mug that is plain, and then I have another mug. I actually have another mug over here that's a cappuccino cup. So I drink a lot of coffee around here. But if I abstract an idea in my head of like, what is a coffee cup? Can I bring out from each one of these things a sense of coffee cup-ness that I know that if I actually hold up a different object, and here I have a marker, then I'm looking at this object and I can say, okay, this is not a coffee cup. How do I know? Well, there's differences between all the coffee cups and this thing, but there's also something the same about all the coffee cups. Okay, a little philosophical lesson for you right there. That's the form is the coffee cupness, and the matter is the coffee cup itself. This particular one that I'm holding that says Hildebrand Project on it, and that's the one that's this coffee cup has this matter. But this coffee cup individually has a form to it. It holds in itself the same coffee cupness as the other cups. So how could we ever say, like, you can't even imagine a world in which you can say, I'm looking at this coffee cup and I'm holding this coffee cup, and what it is in my hand, I'm holding this, but it does not have the form of coffee cupness. We can sort of separate it from its form. And we can think about it as 2 distinct things. That the coffee cupness is not the same as the coffee cup. And so this particular one may actually be a marker. And then somehow, there's this distortion. That's essentially what's happening when people are saying, I'm not male, and I even though I have a male biology, but my personhood, my actual self, however, I don't even know how people talk about themselves, but essence, myself, I think people still use that word, is female. It's like, that's no different than saying this coffee cup has the form of a marker, even though it's in the matter of a coffee cup. They can't be separated. So we hold that to be true at the same time that we are like, all right, well, how and why are people having an experience of something other than what is happening in their body? What is something other than what is true in their body? That's a real experience. That's not being made up by the media. That's not being made up by people who are struggling in the midst of a lot of these things. So we have to really pay attention to this, because this is where our job, our mission, our calling from Christ himself to follow me means that we live in a world of Pharisees who know the law. And Jesus comes into the world of Pharisees to directly and obstinately and with a certain sense of brash self-confidence and higher calling, power and mission contradict the Pharisaical law and the cultural norms. And on both ends, he's contradicting the Pharisaical law, he's contradicting the cultural norms, and he is cutting through the middle with a surgeon's precision. And he's doing things for a different law. It's the law of love. And how does the law of love work? It holds the line between both the objective truth, the law. He's come to fulfill the law, not to abolish the law. But he's also stepping in to the messiness and the pain and the suffering of real people's lives. This is what he means when he says, "Come follow me." This is what it means to be Christian. It doesn't mean to learn the Pharisaical law more so that you can argue every theological point better than anybody else. That's what the Pharisees were doing at the time of Jesus, that he came and deeply angered and contradicted. And we know to what extent. And that is how so many Catholics are acting today. And so many institutions and bodies of media and content and resources. And it's like, how can people not see the connection here between the Pharisees that Jesus had to confront and these organizations and institutional bodies of today, sometimes within the church itself? That's not Jesus. And that's not Catholic. It's never been Catholic, which is why John Paul II is the radical thought leader and example for our contemporary time. And John Paul II, to the extent that Pope Benedict carried on his mission, and this is a heavily qualified statement, to the extent that Pope Francis is carrying on that same ecclesiology, that same mission, and that same expression of the church. This is the life of Christ alive today in our church. And it means meeting people where they're at and taking them somewhere better. It's both. It's the both and. It's that surgeon's precision cutting through that Jesus shows us when he meets the woman at the well. So here's my proposal. I'm asking all of us to think together, to pray together and reflect together on how we can deepen our understanding of the experience of a person who is going through some kind of developmental crisis, to the extent that they don't even know that they're having a developmental crisis in the sense that we know it. But they may think they're just still trying to find out who they are, or they are being victimized by a sort of chaotic culture or chaotic persons in the culture, and then they sort of project all of that pain and suffering onto individual family members, and then parents just don't understand, or the teachers, the church leaders don't understand, and there's this sort of radical rejection of authority because of that sense of pain and woundedness being wrapped up into the same sense of confusion that is being felt internally. And so all of these elements are in the air. And it's up to us, if we want to follow Christ, to learn these elements. Like we really need to learn these elements. We need to spend more time studying the integration of the psychology with these fundamental truths of our faith, most perfectly and beautifully expressed through the philosophy of John Paul II. And so if you're out there studying psychology, you have to study John Paul II if you want to be a Catholic therapist. If you're out there studying theology, you have to study psychology if you want to be effective in ministry, if you want your theology to be more than just academic. And if you're out there in family life or in education space, you have to study both the psychology and the philosophy and the theology to really deepen your sense of ministry. This is our call. This is us following Jesus. And this is where Jesus needs us to follow him today in our culture. This is what's happening right now. So instead of burying our heads and instead of sort of reverting back to old ways of just repeating the truth over and over again and just thinking that that's doing our job of evangelization and ecclesiology and serving the mission of the church and the call to follow Jesus, we need to wake up a little bit here. I think that's really what's happening. All right, so more of what we need. We need to, and by the way, this is what we do in our certification program, if that hasn't been clear from past episodes, or if this is the first time you're really listening to some of our content here. We have a certification program where that's exactly what we're doing, is deeply integrating the philosophy and theology of John Paul II as a Catholic approach to anthropology with the psychological sciences and traditional spirituality. And I don't think there's really anybody else doing that. So that's why I really just encourage people to check that out. And I can't wait till there's competitors in that space. That means that the world is moving in the right direction. But if we go a little deeper here, we talked about these developmental stages, and we talked about how a boy needs the modeling of his dad to step into the world of masculinity, to connect the dots between his biology and his characteristics that he can express as a boy. And there's a lot involved with the brain. There's a lot of compartmentalization. There's a lot that happens with testosterone, with hormone development. There's a lot of repression of other hormones that are more part of the feminine biology and feminine genius. And so hormones like oxytocin and progesterone and estrogen, those hormones are all part of the feminine genius and the feminine biology, which is much more about connection and relationship and person orientation, to seeing the other person and feeling empathy for the other person and feeling warmed and connected hormonally and physically, even through relationship. Whereas men have the biology to be more disposed towards the safety and self-sufficiency and disconnection and compartmentalization and distancing from other persons. And then the testosterone kicks in with aggression and also sexual desire and pursuit. And that's the male biology forming a male brain to be disposed towards masculine genius characteristics more easily, which sometimes is necessary. And then we talked about the fullness of that sexual development being the sort of mastery of both sets of characteristics. The mastery of both sets of characteristics. So the boy has a dad to teach him how to be a man and a mom to teach him how to be a better man. This is Catholic. And we need mom to teach a boy how to become a better man through her feminine genius. How does a boy become a better man? He becomes a better man by learning how to hold and master the characteristics of the feminine genius. Not the feminine biology. That's impossible. But the feminine genius, which is a set of characteristics. He has direct biological access to the set of characteristics known as the masculine genius. That's how we define genius. It's the set of characteristics that a person has more direct access to because of their biology. But the characteristics of the opposite sex can also become each person's mastered characteristics. And so the fullness of sexual development is to have mastery over one's own characteristics and mastery over the other set of characteristics. There will always be a flavor of difference. So the way that a female person expresses characteristics of the masculine genius will still have a sort of flavor of femininity to it. And the way that a male person expresses characteristics of the feminine genius will always have a male flavor to it. But the characteristics themselves are to be held by both. And this is the fullness of human development. This is also the fullness of, because it's human, our spiritual development and our path to holiness. So when you have Mother Teresa acting like the most accomplished CEO, leader, compartmentalized director, she can cut people out, she can separate herself from relationships, and she's acting in all these ways that are stereotypically male. And we're gonna swing back around to stereotypes in a little while. But part of the Catholic approach is actually to dismantle stereotypes. There's a little teaser for you. And we'll probably get into that in the second part, because these are going to be longer episodes because this is so important. But when Mother Teresa is acting out of those characteristics, which are stereotypically and also biologically more predisposed as the masculine genius, she's still going to be doing them in a female way. but the characteristics are what could be defined as the masculine genius. Another great example is when we have, well, it's the perfect example if we're talking about the perfection in Christ. So Jesus does not have female biology. Female biology is what gives rise to the feminine genius of that deep heart connection to another person, empathy, and really stepping into the world of another person. Jesus, the male, literally stepped into the world of the other as radically as possible from divinity into our human existence in time and space. That's a feminine genius move. Well, Jesus had it perfectly. And when we talk about that person orientation, I mean, that's one of the easiest marks of the feminine genius. When we talk about mothers and their nurturance and all these things that are naturally derived from the biology of a woman, which is to have the womb, have a part of the procreative and generative process of making new humans be internal to her body. Well, all of that means that she's set up to be biologically predisposed and oriented towards really thinking, caring, and feeling for another person, even pre-verbally, without even knowing a person, just knowing that a person is a person. And that's why a mother turns towards the baby in her womb and she's oriented with love. Biologically, she's made to do that even before she sees that baby's face or knows that baby and its characteristics that would be what typically motivate a male to then be oriented towards a person. But Mary had that feminine genius perfectly, and she also would have been a perfect teacher for Jesus and his humanity as he developed his characteristics. And when we see Jesus then pouring himself out to the last drop, to death for others, when we see Jesus showing up through history, making it abundantly clear, he keeps trying to tell us how much he's person-oriented in his divinity. It's like, I have a sacred heart. I have divine mercy. I want to come to you. I want you to come to me in the confessional. My oceans of mercy are infinite. My forgiveness, my compassion, my love for you is infinite. Like, he's telling us over and over again, he has the perfection of the feminine genius. So we have to be so careful the way we define these things, because we're creating these illogical conclusions. If we tied the feminine genius to only being that quality that women can have, then it wouldn't make sense to define anything of the feminine genius as something that Jesus has. And when we define masculine or feminine qualities that we tie them to Mary, then Pope Benedict, as Cardinal Ratzinger, in the letter to bishops on the collaboration of women and men in the church, would have been in error when he said, talking about the feminine genius of Mary, let us not forget that we are talking ultimately about human characteristics that every person is called to emulate. And we'll link that document in that quote right in the show notes. And that's a little bit of a summary, but we're going to link the document and you can go find it for yourself and read it. It's a short read and it's a beautiful read. But that's what we're talking about here. And Cardinal Ratzinger / Pope Benedict taught this magisterially. This is what we really believe about the feminine genius. This is what we really can then extrapolate and believe about the masculine genius. So we have psychosexual developmental phases where a little boy is learning how to become a man by being in a relationship with his dad and then also having his masculinity complemented by his mom. And there are phases where, and any parent will know this, there are normal phases of development where a little boy is initially super attached to mom as an infant, literally attached at the breast, and that's where the boy is being held and nurtured and validated and getting the initial sort of sense, obviously sort of developing from what was initially actually in the womb, but carrying on that initial sense with more awareness, consciousness that's developing in terms of being held by mom. And then that turns into a self-awareness. There's phases where a little boy starts to recognize my body is different, especially if he has sisters, or when he sees mom and he knows his body is different than mom's body at some point along the way. And then there's also a turning towards dad at one point when there's that recognition of sexual differentiation. And then dad needs to be there. Dad needs to be there to hold that relationship and model and emulate masculinity. And at the same time, there's these really profoundly important dynamics between mom and dad. And the little boy is watching with eager openness and just like a sponge, just absorbing all the little nuances. How does mom treat dad? Because I'm like dad. I'm going to be like dad. I'm a boy like dad is. How does mom treat dad? Now, children are not consciously thinking these things. These are happening in the psyche. This is something that psychologically, again, St. John Paul II, not a lot of people realize this. John Paul II wrote out the blueprint of the human person and explained the psyche and the unconscious and the subconscious better than and more than St. Thomas Aquinas or any other teachers in the history of the church. Because that's a relatively new concept. I mean, Freud brought in a sense of the unconscious. And then it's like, okay, now that's 20th century, and now that becomes part of all these drives, and then we have the sexual drive and the anger drive, and then now that's causing confusion, and we start to, and that gets wrapped into the sexual revolution, and we're back to where I started talking about. John Paul II's answering the questions of culture with language that meets the contemporary need. The most basic, fundamental answer, again, this is not being taught, and this is like so crazy to me that there's no psychological institute of St. John Paul II. Like, there's the beautiful work of the John Paul II Institute, and there are good Catholic psychology programs, but the John Paul II Institute is doing all theology, and then the other psychology programs are not actually getting deep into the philosophy and theology and psychology of John Paul II. So, but this is what John Paul II provided the world and the church, because this is what God knows we needed in the 20th and 21st century, is an understanding of the unconscious, the subconscious, the way that we are bringing these things in. JP2 has a book, Memory and Identity. He has a whole philosophical grounding in this blueprint of the human person. So a little child absorbing and observing interactions between mom and dad. That little boy is seeing the way mom treats dad. He's not thinking like masculinity is dangerous for me because mom is screaming at dad, or mom ignores dad, or mom gives dad the silent treatment or the cold shoulder, or there's all these manipulative dynamics between mom and dad, or mom kicks dad out of the house, or the mom is just sort of submitting to abusive behaviors from dad, or mom is drinking too much to take to numb herself because of dad's abuse. Like, all these other things that happen, a multitude of variables that happen in the development of a person are all affecting that little boy who is like a sponge, predisposed and open to, by God's design, understanding what it is to be a man and understanding what it is to be a man in relationship to woman. And that's why moms and dads both need to be in the picture, and that's why moms and dads are so critically important, and why distortions or imperfections in the interactions between mom and dad, or even the presence of mom and dad, will be profoundly consequential to the development of identity and self for that little boy. And then everything I'm saying about boys, it's the same thing for little girls. So little girls need to have that modeling and that exemplary sort of relationship with mom, teaching her how to become a woman. And the way that dad is disposed to mom is training her how to expect to be treated by men as a woman. And then the reactions to each, That little boy learns how to react to women by the way that dad is reacting to mom. The little girl is reacting to men the way that mom teaches her how to react to men. And then the complementary relationship itself is also one of that sexual complementarity, and not sexual in the sense of feelings of pleasure, but sexual in the sense of identity as a male or female. And that little girl is being validated, received, blessed, honored, reverenced as a girl by her dad in a way that her mom can't do. That little boy is being blessed, honored, and validated and received in a way from his mom through complementarity that can't be from dad. So when that little boy wants to jump off the bed and mom's looking at him, and even though she's feeling terror in the deepest pit of her stomach, she looks at him and goes, I believe you can do that. I believe in you. And wow, that takes so much courage. Look at you. You're overcoming your fear. And then after, accomplishment, like, that was amazing. I was so nervous. And you did it. You pulled it off. And look at you overcame that accomplishment. And I'm so proud of you. There's nothing like a woman's validation to a man's aggression and power and strength and courage to validate that deepest sense of his own development in his masculine identity than what a woman can provide. Dads give the pat on the shoulder. Dads open up the door. Dads lead the way. Dads show the way. But and boys need that dad's validation as well. But there's something very different from having it from mom. And same thing for little girls when it comes to that connection, the empathy, the heart, the sort of caring, nurturing dimensions of her femininity. She's receiving it from mom. Mom should be modeling it. Mom should be leading the way. Mom should be showing the way. But there's nothing like having dad see the way that she's able to care and connect and love, and her heart being so big and having all of those budding capacities for the feminine genius in her. And then we go through new developmental stages. And so then you have little boys learning how to be connecting and in relationship and having that dimension of feminine genius, literally from mom, modeling now the feminine genius qualities. And if she's established that rapport through her complementarity, she's established a sense of trustworthiness and goodness. And it's like, wow, mom, we've forged this relationship. Mom is loving me and loves my boyhood. She loves my boyness. And you see mom holding the authority of a matriarch. And out of her matriarchal position of the family, she's blessing, validating, receiving, and in so many ways empowering that development of that little boy as a self. And then you have mom stepping in also as an authority, as a matriarchal authority, to teach her little boy how to be a better boy and eventually a better man, because he can care for and have compassion and connection and affection in the way that she can easily due to her biology. And there are multitudes of layers of this, and it becomes compounded when you have a dad who's been formed well and has become a better man, also showing his son how to be a man formed by feminine genius. And so you see that there's this back and forth, beautifully orchestrated as a family, as a school of love. This is what we mean, the school of love. And then this is where persons are formed. Now, this is a lot that connects back to gender from the last episode that I'm opening up even more. But with detail here, now I want to just open up your minds to reflect on how distorting it becomes, how disorienting it becomes if you don't have a dad to model healthy masculinity to a boy and to complement the healthy femininity of a girl, and you don't have a mom to model healthy femininity to a girl and to complement the healthy masculinity of her boy. There are so many places where this goes sideways. And it's really a wonder. It's really a miracle that we haven't had these kinds of issues before. Like, I don't even know how we've gotten this far without having such significant distortions and disorientations and confusion and chaos in the world of gender prior to this. But I think that the structure, the fabric of society has just naturally held the line. And if the structure of society, the fabric of society holds a sense of the family, a sense of where moms and dads are placed, then maybe that's what's protected this just widespread unhinging. So this is a culmination of factors. And the point of this podcast is not to sort of present an ideological hypothesis for how we got here. But I do very simply think that it's a confluence of factors of sort of a philosophical dualism and the split of body and spirit. And then we have this sort of rebellion against patriarchy and this sort of postmodern industrial revolutionary kind of mindset. Anyways, we could go on and on about all that stuff. But I think that here we are, however we got here. And now we see that this is unraveling. But if we connect the dots between psychosexual development from a healthy, integrated Catholic psychological perspective, and then gender dysphoria and confusion, I think we can make a lot more sense of everything that's going on right now. And I do think that even though things have not erupted on the surface to this extent, I think that there's been a long history in the world of all sorts of other manifestations of these same problems. So, I think that people's identity and gender, sort of gender identity, to use that term loosely, experience of oneself in one's gender, I think has been completely fractured throughout history. I think there's plenty of experiences and examples of that throughout history, but there are always these like sort of isolated, either, literary figures or sort of elite figures of society where people have more freedom in the upper echelons of class to go outside the boundaries of what's normal and acceptable, but it's always secret. It's always been hidden. And it's been a luxury, I think, of the rich, and a luxury of, having too much leisure and not just having to sort of buckle down and just kind of make life acceptable and work. So anyway, again, more ideological stuff. But I do think if we look back in history, we'll find all sorts of examples of the same exact gender confusion. And when we start to dig into the family dynamics and biographies of people who have had these kinds of gender confusions, we'll always find the same realities. There's always a rupture. There's always a distortion with mom and dad. There's always something that we can see pronounced disorientation in relationships with mom and dad or between mom and dad. That this structure, this paradigm of development makes perfect sense. And now we end up with all different ways to express it. So before, we had a hidden life of disorientation and expressing any of these things, this confusion, this pain, this suffering of not knowing how one is to act as oneself, and then not getting good examples, not getting complimented as valuable from the other and the opposite, and all these things finds other outlets. Well, all of a sudden now with the internet, with widespread political things, it's like the outlet is easy. Like all of a sudden it's in your face. It's being presented to every single person, every child. This is the movement moving into school systems. It's like every child now is being taught before they even know what sexual identity is or anything about sex. It's like, oh, but you have the choice now. You have the freedom to choose. You're supposed to choose who you become. Now, all of a sudden, very normal phases of sort of lowercase c confusion that normally get resolved through other friendships and relationships and developmentally healthy things that we can, we teach a lot deeper, and we can look at a lot more sort of in deeper complexities. Those would normally get resolved. Now we're like grabbing them at these vulnerable points of development and ripping them away from normal human development and actually placing them in these other trajectories, on these other paths that are so chaotic. And so it actually makes sense why we have gender dysphoria happening. It makes sense why culturally it's happening very quickly, because there's been this cultural, environmental sort of atmosphere that just enhances and nurtures this disorientation to go in different directions other than sort of back in line with the truth of the human person in our bodies, teaching us who we really are as male or female. And so now people are just really confused, and people are really disoriented. And here's the thing, underneath all of this, and this is what I want to get to and more in the next, is that there's a lot of self-hatred. Because when one doesn't understand oneself, one becomes one's own enemy. I want to repeat that. When one doesn't understand oneself, one becomes one's own enemy. And that's because we have these parts that want to know we are solid, we are stable, we are unified, we know who we are, we know what we're about. We have like an inner compass and an inner trajectory that moves us towards a direction of flourishing, of success, of growth. And so just as we have a developmental trajectory to grow as bodies, we want to go from, toddler forward. We want to grow from pre-adolescence to adolescence. When I say we want, I just mean it's in our biology. Like, our biology is automatically moving in that direction, whether we want to or not, whether we like it or not. That same trajectory biologically is actually in us personally and spiritually. And then all of a sudden it finds things that are getting in its way. Like, you don't know who you are? That's not going to get you to move forward. So then we become our worst enemy. And so underneath all of this stuff that's happening is a lot of self-hatred. And so I think that's what we want to break apart as well. So here's to just sort of unpack a little bit more of what I'm proposing. And again, we're going to talk a lot more about this in the next episode, but we have these objective truths about our personhood. We are a unity of body and spirit. Our bodies exist as either a male form or a female form. And to be more precise, in either male matter or female matter in our biology. And since we are unity of body and spirit, therefore, we can also know that we are either a male or a female person in form as well as matter. And that's true. And then we also have this subjective experience that individuals are feeling confused, rejected, disoriented, and ultimately sort of estranged from themselves. And therefore they become their own worst enemies. So where are we going to go as a church? How are we going to meet people in this space? If you understood these realities, how are you going to actually know how then to talk about this situation and to enter deeper into communion with those who are suffering and left out and set aside? Jesus met the woman at the well who was estranged. She was rejected. She was left out and set aside. She was made to go to the well in the middle of the hot noonday sun, not with the other women getting the water when it was cooler. She was rejected because of her bad choices, because of her situation that she was in, yes, but also she was longing for something that could satisfy her in the midst of all of that. And so Jesus meets her there. He goes to the well. He goes to the hot noonday sun. He goes to the place where she was rejected and relegated to. And he meets her and engages in conversation with her. Already something radically different than what any of the Pharisees would have done and even her own townspeople would have done. And he listens to her more than anybody else would have ever done. And he points out to her, after building rapport and trust and seeing her and talking with her and enticing a little bit by dropping a little hint that maybe I can give you what you're looking for. And he's playing into her confusion and her reticence. Why are you talking to me? Who Jews and Samaritans don't talk to each other. And it's like, what? It's a little like offsetting. It's like confusing a little bit. But then he starts to speak because he's engaged her, because his first act was meeting her there, going to where she was relegated to. And that opens the door to the deeper conversation. And eventually, it opens the door to him sharing that objective truth with her and showing her the way to happiness, true holiness, true virtue. We are called to follow Jesus. And that's what I'm putting out there right now. How can we bring together, yes, the psychological sciences, yes, an understanding of psychosexual development, developmental psychology, and also, yes, the truths of the human person and the Catholic view of the person and our faith. Yes, and yes. Both and integrated, all of the above. This is our call to follow Jesus. And it's a bit radical, and it means we'll probably upset some people. But I think it also points the way forward and ultimately shows the way through and shines the light at the end of the darkness of this tunnel. So I really want to know what you think, because I think, where we're going to go next is we're going to talk about how we got to pick apart, and I've mentioned this already, and I'm going to talk about this in the next episode, the stereotypes of gender that have developed over the centuries. In some ways, they were the glue that held that fabric together, that maintained normal operating procedures moving through time, which is why I think, again, culturally, that glue is now dissolving and the whole thing is unraveling. And I think in some ways the stereotypes have kept us there. So if you think about traditional sex roles and gender roles, and every culture has their own set, and some of them are deeper than others. Some of those particular sort of nuances of gender, cultural gender roles, some are very deeply embedded, some are sort of more superficial. But we want to be able to talk about this because we, again, as Catholics, don't want to present or provide an answer that is flimsy or superficial or easily dismantled philosophically. So I think this is a really important part of this conversation. And I think that this is the thing that is going to change as a result of going through the gender revolution. And when we get to the other side of the gender revolution, just like the sexual revolution, we are going to see that some of the answers that are required to answer the cultural confusion are also going to point us out a way forward in the church that is better than what we had before. The answer to the sexual revolution was the theology of the body. It answered the questions that the culture was asking, and it also pointed a way forward for us in the church that was better than the way that was ever articulated before. Again, not the teachings themselves, that was always present, but the very obscure writings of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux were not the normal talking points of a Catholic in the pews going to a retreat or going to a class. It's because of the sexual revolution that we got the theology of the body, and the answers pointed the answer out to the culture and to us internally. Here's the new evangelization. Well, now we're in the middle of the gender revolution. And the fruit of the gender revolution is going to be answers to the culture questions and ways to think about ourselves even for those of us inside the church, that are better articulated than what was here before us. And so we have to be willing to evaluate some of the things that have come through in terms of gender stereotypes. So between these two pendulum arms or ends of gender ideology on one hand, and then it swings all the way over to gender stereotypes on the other, I want to bring us straight down the middle, and the middle is gender integration. Gender integration. I'm throwing out new terms here. And the answer to the gender revolution is going to be gender integration. And what do I mean by I use integration everywhere. I always talk about integration. So let's define our terms. We're talking about an understanding of selves as being objectively grounded in our biology as hylomorphic unities of body and spirit, and also open to development in ourselves through the perfection of relationship with the opposite, taking on characteristics of the qualities of the opposite gender. And that means men being more compassionate, men being more person-oriented, men being more intuitive, men being more like those qualities of the feminine genius. And at the same time, women becoming more compartmentalized, women having a deepened capacity to take a step back, look objectively at the situation, even if it means ignoring persons involved at the moment, and then stepping back in to have different approaches and different perspectives. And then men and women together learning how to accept and understand and appreciate the characteristics and values of each other's genius. And then, especially in marriage, having the beauty of that gift of holding both together and realizing that as a team, we're going to do more and accomplish something better than we could have ever done on our own. That's the whole point. That's what we're leading towards. That's gender integration, and that's the answer that I'm proposing. And then I would love to get more people on board with so that we can actually create this path forward and light at the end of this very dark tunnel right now. Okay, that's enough for today. Hope this has blessed you. As always, please let me know where you're at, how you're receiving this. And we're going to keep unpacking this in next episodes. So I probably missed some things here. Please know that my heart is to meet people where they're at. I'm trying to follow the example of Jesus in meeting the woman at the well. And if I've offended or said things in a way that doesn't have the sense of compassion and love that Christ did, then I apologize, and I will own that. So please let me know that too, because a lot of the listeners I don't have relationship with, and this is an experience right now. You're listening, and I'm speaking, and you're taking this time to take in what I'm saying, and we maybe don't have a real relationship yet in which I know you, you know me, we've built trust, and so I'm taking liberties now that may be overstepping my boundaries in terms of compassion. So at least please know my intention is not to hurt or offend, and know that I am always open to correction, and I'm always open to nuance, and I'm always open to becoming a better version of myself. I want to, and I know that means that today I'm not the best version of myself that I can be. So help me become a better version of myself tomorrow by letting me know ways that I can grow. All right. God bless you.